this session now. So this recording, this is a public meeting and it will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the OSSI website a day or two after we wrap up this meeting. So we are going to start with roll call and just say here or yes if you are here. And I'm going to do this in alphabetical order by last name. So Michael Bayek.
Here.
Josh Boots.
Here.
Abraham Clayman.
Here.
Chelsea Coffin.
Here.
Jen Comey.
Here.
Jeanette Fernandez.
Here.
Alan Francois. Sharon Gaskins. Jessica Giles.
Yes. Here.
Great. William Henderson. Kubila Huddleston.
Here.
Leicester Johnson.
Here.
Great. Mary Levy.
Here.
Jack McCarthy. Alonzo Montalvo. Stephen Regis. Kathy Riley.
Here. I'm here.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Allison Road.
Here.
Justin Rydstrom. Nate Schwartz.
Here.
Atima Shahi. She is not here. She emailed me ahead of time. Ashley Simpson Baird is.
I'm here.
Okay, you're here. Yes, I just saw your chat. Drew Snyder.
Here.
Raymond Whedon.
Here.
Jonathan Weinstein. Kevin Wenzel.
Here.
And Margie Yeager.
Here.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Can you go to the next slide, Patrice? Great. So as I mentioned before, this is the second meeting of the working group and it's a public meeting. So everyone whose name I just read is a panelist for this meeting. And as a panelist, if possible, we do ask that you put your video on, and I just realized mine is off, so I'm going to turn mine on. If you can, put your video on. If you would like to speak, there is a raise your hand feature, or we'll stop throughout the presentation to open it up to discussion or questions. If you want to drop something in the chat, just make sure that you are chatting everyone so that everyone can see it. And we will stop from time to time and read some of the comments that are in the chat. We do have a number of attendees. So as a public meeting, we will have a public comment period at the end of the meeting. And for anyone that is an attendee, when we open it up for public comment, you can raise your hand or send me a chat and I can unmute you and you can provide public comment during that time. Trying to think if there's anything else that I need to share, but I think that's it. Michelle or Patrice can correct me if there's something else that needs to be added. But for our agenda today, we just did roll call. We are going to do a quick recap of the September meeting that we had a few weeks ago. Then we are going to dive in a little bit with the 2020 working group recommendations. There was a request last time to see those recommendations and just discuss the status of them. Today we're going to do a deep dive into adult schools and the adult school weight. And we have a bunch of slides that were shared from some of the adult schools in the district. And then we're going to spend some time just talking about the other topics that were raised in the first meeting, two of which were the middle school weight and then the special education weights. And then we will open it up to that public comment period that I had previously mentioned. So you can go to the next slide, Patrice. So just as a recap, when we talked about proposed topics for this session of the working group, it did seem like there was strong support in examining the adult weight, and we do have a number of adult schools represented on the working group. There were some concerns about revisiting the at-risk weight because we just made changes to it, and the group felt that introducing too much instability for LEAs is too soon given recent changes, and there's not enough time or data to see the impact of those recent changes that were made to the at-risk weight and the addition of the at-risk concentration weight. There was interest in revisiting the special education costs and services with a recognition of the complexities and the challenges of doing so. There was also interest in exploring the middle school weight given the recent performance data showing those gaps. And then there was the request to review the status of recommendations from the 2020 UPSFF Working Group. So you can go to the next slide, Patrice. But actually, another one of the things that was brought up last time was just a history of the UPSFF weights. And Mary Levy, thank you to you. She sent a lot of great information about all of the historical changes that have happened to the UPSFF weights over time. And what we're looking at on the screen is just the grade level weights right now, and the significant changes that have been made to the grade level weights over the past 15-ish years. So what we found is that the majority or the major changes happened in 2 years, fiscal year 2009 and fiscal year 2015. And we show how the weights have changed since those changes have been made. So for example, you'll see that the pre-K3 weight started at 1.16 in 2008. And then in 2009, it was increased to 1.34, and it has remained at that weight up until today. And similar increase for the pre-K4 kindergarten weight, which saw an increase in 2009. The grades 1 through 3 weight actually went down by 0.03 and has maintained that change since that change in 2009. Grades 4 through 5 has stayed consistent at 1. And the middle school grades 6 through 8 have increased slightly from 1 to 1.08 now. The high school weight was 1.17 in 2008, and it fluctuated down and then came back up to 1.22. The alternative weight started at 1.23. It also went down in 2009 and then saw subsequent increases in FY15 and in FY23. So that weight is 1.52 today. The adult weight started at 0.75 and today it is 0.91. And the special education schools weight has maintained at 1.17 through the past 15 years. You can go to the next slide, Patrice. So the special education weights have also fluctuated, but since 2008, all 4 of the special education level weights have increased, and you'll see that in this chart. For example, SPED level 1 was 0.54, and now it's increased to 0.97. And you can see the increases that each of the SPED levels we've seen over the past 15 years. Then at the bottom, we're also just noting the other supplemental weights. So the at-risk weight was created in FY15, and it started at 0.226, and now it is at 0.24. As we mentioned, or as we know for last school year, the elementary and the secondary EL weights were created in FY22. The high school overage at-risk supplemental weight was added in FY22. And for this school year, the at-risk concentration weights were added. Go to the next slide. Before I jump in, can you go back one? I just want to make sure that we address any questions on the weight changes, or if anybody has any comments that they'd like to share regarding the historical data that we have just seen. And I'll just read Kathy in the chat. Many of these changes did not come from this group necessarily. Were these changes made by OSSI? If anybody wants to answer that, I don't think that OSSI was the one that makes the recommendations for changes to the weights. These are made mostly by the mayor and council, but I can't remember if there was any specific, if it was the adequacy study or what was the trigger for increasing the weights. We can, if no one knows the answer to that question, then we can certainly. Okay, Mary, yes, please enlighten us.
The funding formula legislation actually charges OSSI with the responsibility of reviewing and making recommendations. That office is, of course, appointed by the mayor. And definitely the weights changed after the adequacy study because the mayor and council wanted to follow it to some degree. They did not follow the weights exactly because the weights recommended in the adequacy study were based on a particular foundation amount. And the mayor and council never happened to use that particular foundation amount. So there's sort of a disjunction there. When you're considering the adequacy study, there is a disjunction between actuality and the assumption of what the foundation should be in the adequacy study.
So you're saying that the dollar amounts in the adequacy study were not aligned when those changes were made?
No, it's the weights. It's the weights. The weights were not aligned.
Okay.
And one can, if we want to generate a particular dollar amount that matches that in the adequacy study, you have to look at the foundation that is actually being used and then work backwards. I can't say exactly, what went on in the mayor's office in making the decision as to what to use. But you can't just look at the adequacy study and say, well, they said the weight should be 0.35. So we need to do that. No, you have to tie it to the foundation amount.
Right, of course. Are there any other questions or comments before we jump to the next slide?
Could I just ask, as we go forward, since they're going to be doing another adequacy study, I think it would be helpful to the group to understand exactly what our role is and where else recommendations get made. And then, is our recommendations just the mayor? Also just, I know the mayor reviews what we recommend and decides what to do. But clearly this, I know we never considered these sped weights, and I know we didn't consider the middle school weight that came up. So I just, I just think it would be good to know what the whole universe is of how the UPSFF weights get changed.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kathy, the rest of the universe is also the rest of the city budget in the broadest sense of the terms, right? That this is one piece of the pie and a fairly large piece of the pie. I was just looking at the special education weights. I don't think they have changed since 2014, it looks like. So they've remained pretty steady from 2015 over. So the last 8 years now, the special education weight has not changed. And so I mean, I think from this group provides a strong set of recommendations that then have a fiscal impact that has to be weighed with
Right, of
various
course.
other priorities. Yeah. And
No,
so
I
I think
just-
sometimes it's like, can we get, and I think actually when we get to the next slide, we like see some of this, right? Like the group recommends something. Can we get part of the way there? Or can we do
Sure,
something
it's just a
similar,
recommendation.
etc.? Yeah.
No, I just know that before 2007, we used to meet continuously. It wasn't on a 2-year thing. It was almost a monthly thing all year to take some time to go over these things, and it was all under OSSI. So I was just curious. I mean, of course, it's a recommendation. Of course, it has to fit in with the rest of the budget. So thank you.
Monthly. That's it's fun.
I don't see any other hands or comments, so I think we can go to the next slide. Great. So on this slide, this is a list of the recommendations that the working group made 2 years ago in the working group report. So we'll just go through them one by one, especially for the folks that are new to the working group. So the first recommendation was to increase the foundation level to account for LEA's anticipated increases in personnel and non-personnel costs. So this recommendation was implemented by the mayor. We have seen the foundation level increase most recently by 5.9% for FY23. The second recommendation was additional funding allocated through a new supplemental weight for students who have 2 or more at-risk characteristics. So this weight, we're saying that it was partially implemented, while the specific recommendation was not implemented. There was a new added weight for overage high school students. So for LEAs that have students that are overage high school students, those students will get the at-risk weight and the overage at-risk supplement weight. The third recommendation was to revise the name of the category at risk of academic failure. So changing the name of at risk to a language that is more asset-based rather than deficit-based. That recommendation was not implemented. There was a recommendation to increase the English learners weight to match the recommended weight from the 2013 Cost of Student Achievement Report, aka the adequacy study, to 0.61. And then there was also a recommendation for a new supplemental EL weight for students who are designated as students with limited or interrupted formal education or new to the country, and tiering the EL weight based on grade level. So these were partially implemented when we added a secondary EL weight of 0.75. I think the slide got a little messed up, but then the weight, the recommendation to add SLIFE or new to country, that one was not implemented. And then finally, automatically increase the alternative student weight to keep pace with the sum of the high school grade and at risk of academic failure weights should either have incremental changes. And this one was implemented. We did write this one into DC code so that the sum of the high school weight and the at-risk weight will equal the alternative student weight. And with a small note that when council added the new at-risk concentration weight in their amendment to the mayor's budget, they did not apply that at-risk concentration weight to the alternative weight. So does anybody have any questions or comments about the recommendations that were made last time? And I'll just read some of the comments in the chat. Mary Levy said the reason that adult, alternative, and special education schools were given a school rather than a student weight is that they were ungraded. So thank you for that additional clarification, Mary. Jen says, so I'm like reading this chat as it's happening. I recall that we used to have
Yeah.
separate special
That's
education
okay.
compliance weight. Oh, okay.
Yeah, Ryan, I think Kevin has corrected me that I'm just remembering.
Yes, we
incorrectly.
still do have the special ed compliance weight and the attorney's fee supplement weight. Yes. And if there are no additional comments or questions, we can go to the next slide. And I believe I turn it over to you now, Michelle.
Thank you. So switching gears a little bit, last time we had discussed taking a deeper dive into looking at the adult weight. So we wanted to do some level setting first with the group. And I'm going to say, Lester and Ashley, you should feel free to interrupt me and chime in at any point in time, because I'm also not going to take credit for a lot of this really great data that has already been pulled by the group. Several of the adult schools did a survey during the pandemic in 2020 to better understand the demographics of adult learners. And so we have some of that information here to also just set the foundation with the group as we start the conversation into re-examining the adult weight. And so this page first just shows some of the demographic information from the population that was surveyed. And so a pretty widespread survey was done again in 2020 to look at who adult learners are. The first bar shows you by race and ethnicity. So you see about 58% of adult learners responded were Latinx and 26% were Black. The next one then shows by age. So you see the percentage that are under 18 to 25, and then the vast majority are 26 and over. The gender ratios weights slightly more towards female, with 70% folks being female. Primary language majority was Spanish. And then the majority of folks have less than a high school diploma when they are joining the adult learner space.
Can I just ask?
Yes.
Was this a survey response, like the adult charter schools were responding to this survey and providing
Correct.
their demographic data?
Correct.
No, sorry, the
Right?
respondents
No,
were
sorry.
were actually students. So this wasn't a survey of schools, it was a survey of students themselves. So these are things that students identified in their survey responses.
Sorry, Ryan, misinterpreted your question.
Thanks.
All right, Patrice, we can go to the next slide. Again, just pulling out some of the high-level information about demographics. 71% of adult learners have a high school education or less. 17% shared also having children with learning differences, and 43 reported having children who are English language learners. And so something that was covered last working group by some of the adult representatives was the emphasis that oftentimes our adult learners have children who are also in the public education system, and the level of research demonstrating the importance that adult education can also have on children's education. I'm going to pause here. Oh, just going to go back to the last slide just because I see some questions here. Quibilla is asking about learning differences. So Ashley, I don't know if you have a definition there based on the survey that was conducted. And then Chelsea actually dropped the survey itself into the chat.
A couple of things. First of all, there were 2 surveys, and I think these data points you pulled from are not from the surveys. I think these were from data reported from individual charter schools, but I'm not quite sure where you got them from. I can speak to the surveys, but I'm not sure where these data points are coming from. Oh, they
This
said
was the Allison's link that I think was also referring to the survey.
If it's helpful, I'm recognizing this chart from the publication that we worked on.
oh, okay. Is it
And
the second survey?
this is I believe this is from the spring 2020 survey, and the title says survey respondents. Anyway, it's just
I recognize the previous table. I don't recognize this one.
this one. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. The last one was
We can
definitely
come
from
back
a
to that
student
as well.
survey, but I think these are school reported data points. But I can go back and dig on the stuff that Allison sent to figure it out.
Awesome, thank you. Patrice, if you go to the next slide. The survey similarly looked at what benefits adult learners access. So only about 30% of adult learners indicated that they do not receive benefits. The remainder indicated which types of benefits they receive, ranging from the DC Healthcare Alliance to SNAP, WIC, TANF, Social Security and Disability benefits, housing vouchers, etc. And then if we go to the next slide, some more information, again, based on charter program reports and data from adult charter schools. More than 90% of adult learners have low incomes. About a third have elementary school level education and are currently unemployed. 56% were employed at entry. Most of those are folks who are working in the service industry. And then again, more than half have less than a high school diploma, and those who do have a high school diploma often have low literacy and numeracy rates. So again, this was a mix of information from program reports from adult charter schools, as well as I think specific data that was collected across a variety of surveys. And then we last week, 2 weeks ago, convened several of the adult schools to just get, and this was still at a fairly qualitative level, and I think we'll get into then, what additional information we need. But some of what we heard from adult schools, both on the structures as well as some of the challenges that adult schools face, is listed here. And again, Lissester and Ashley, please feel free to chime in, interrupt me, etc. Just again, level setting, adult schools, students are considered full-time based on 12 hours a week of instruction. So this is written into DC code that a full-time student is 12 hours a week. There are some schools that provide more contact hours than that go beyond the full-time designation. Many adult schools indicated that they operate programming year-round and are enrolling and onboarding students throughout the year. So I know there were some questions around the October 5th count day applicability to adult schools. The buildings are typically operating pretty long periods of time due to the combination of morning and evening classes. So even if classes themselves are for a shorter period of time than K through 12 programming, the buildings are in operations for roughly 12-hour days when we take into account the evening classes. And a lot of the adult charter schools talked about paying faculty to work split structures and the challenges there. So if you had faculty who were teaching a few hours in the morning and then a few hours in the evening, those folks being salaried employees, but needing to pay those folks at competitive full-time salary levels, and the challenges of them navigating having to work in the evenings, not being able to necessarily do something else during the day, and that leading to the last point around difficulty in competing on salaries with pre-K through 12 programs, in particular given limited access to some of the federal funding, as well as not being able to leverage the supplemental UPSFF weights. So one of the examples given was that many students age out of IDEA funding because they are adults, but the schools are continuing to serve them at those levels of need based on their previous IEPs, for example. I'm going to pause here on this slide. First, Ashley and Lester and Ryan, if there's anything that you would like to add or just shed more light on in here, and then also open it up to the group a little bit for any questions.
There was one question in the chat that Kathy asked, how many adult learners are there across both sectors in adult learner schools? And Kevin had responded that DCPS is projecting 412 students for FY23. And Abe, thank you for dropping in the chat. 4,100 projected for charters in FY23, which is up from 4,050 in FY22. So if we just add the projected amounts, it looks like there's 4,500 adult learners across both sectors projected for FY23.
Could I ask if, like I know in the state schools, they take students that are over 16, but they are not eligible for the at-risk rate because they're in an adult school. So in these schools, are we just, like I imagine, is the 412 just the students that are enrolled in the Roosevelt and Blue State schools that are over 18? And then when we look at the adult schools, like, are the charter adult schools for only adults? So there are only students that are over 18 in those schools? Like what, because I know there's more than 412 students in Roosevelt State and Blue State, so I'm trying to understand that. And if this is what we're considering is the weight to the school, or is it to the weight to the students in the school as we look at this?
So I'll answer on the DCPS side, Kathy, which is all of the Opportunity Academies, so Blue Stay, Roosevelt Stay, and Luke Seymour have a combination of alternative and adult students. The alternative students are funded based on the alternative regulations that OSSI promulgated, and the adult students are based on kind of the rest. So it's I think Luke might have all alternative students, and then there's a mix at the stays. But that's the classification is really based on the identification from the standards, the funding standards that OSSI has promulgated.
So they don't get the high school weight even though they're 16 because they get the alternative weight if they're in Roosevelt State and they're under 18. And then if they're adults, they get the adult weight.
So they would need, in order to be considered an alternative, to receive alternative funding, the student needs to meet certain characteristics. And those characteristics are, there is an age range. So the student needs to be between 13 and 24. The student needs to be attending full time, and the student needs to be on track for a secondary academic credential. So if any of the students in those opportunity academies are meeting those requirements, then they would be received, then DCPS would receive the alternative funding for those students. And if not, I think that they would be at the adult level, but I don't want to speak for DCPS. I'm not so familiar with their enrollment.
That's right. Yep.
So we're looking at the adult. We're not looking at the alternative. Is that right? So in the charter schools, these are all adults. They are all over 18. Is that the category they fit in? They don't fit into the alternative category, even though the alternative category. So all this data is based on adult
schools, adult students. Yeah. Now there was conversation
because they
with the adult schools that they previously qualified for alternative funding as well, and that did change at one point in time, and so they currently do not qualify for alternative funding.
Yeah, there are some charter LEAs that have adult and alternative students. I'm going to try to list them all off the top of my head. Maya Angelou, the high school and the Young Adult Learning Center, The Next Step Public Charter School has alternative and adult. LAYC Career Academy has adult and alternative. And I think those are the only ones that have a mix. Then there's some other schools like Youth Build that is all alternative.
So our universe is we're looking at the adult, but it seems like we're kind of looking at how it intermixes, how it mixes up with the alternative.
So I mean, so we're talking right now about when we're talking about adult school structures, we are talking about the adult weight and what I think we will get there in a slide or two, like what changes we want to make specifically for adult funding, which means the adult weight, and not the alternative funding rate.
So in the qualification for alternative, when it says full-time, it's not just 12 hours for alternative, is it the same as it is for high school? So it's
Yes.
different hours that are required if you're an alternative student in one of these
Yes.
schools. Okay,
Yes.
thanks. I appreciate your time on this.
Yeah, of course.
Awesome. So at this point, we would love to just open it up for discussion, and if folks have additional clarifying questions, don't want to stop that conversation as well. But open to understand from various folks' perspective what additional information may be needed to help make an informed decision about any potential changes to the adult weight, as well as what potential options we would want to explore. So one would be increasing the adult weight across the board. Inclusion of adult weight into adult students into other supplemental weights. So for example, making them eligible to receive special education funding or receive at-risk funding, or a new grade level or supplemental weight for certain adult learners. And so this could look like if there are adult learners who are being educated for more than the 12 contact hours that qualify as a full-time student, is there a different grade level weight or a supplemental weight that is offered for adult learners who may qualify, who fall into another specific characteristic that we want to target funding towards. And then if there are other options that I haven't listed here that folks are interested in exploring, would also open it up to discussion there as well.
This isn't answering any of these, I'm make sure I state this first. But to Kathy's question, or even maybe sub-question, where can we find the list of adult schools and then the number of students that we're talking about per school?
I think OSSE's enrollment audit data would be the best place for that. But we can also just quickly look at what some of the enrollment trends are, to give you a sense of that. Jack, I'm seeing your question as well. But OSSE's enrollment data will have the adult schools and the numbers of students within each school that are marked as adult students.
Yeah, and that's probably the best way to figure out like financial implications of like changing the adult weight, for example. We could easily calculate like how much money that would cost. So I think that that's something that we can easily pull for this group to get the full scope of the the adult enrollment. And we can do that going back a couple years to address Jack's question about enrollment trends.
Guess I have a little bit of a rudimentary question because I'm not as familiar with the adult learner population. So, right, like our pre-K, well, not pre-K, but a lot of the students, right, the goal here with these supplemental weights is to help boost their academic outcomes, right? What are the outcomes, I guess, of our adult learners? Like, what are we looking to affect through this? wait, like, are they taking standardized tests? Like, what's happening with those students? And I'm asking because I'm just trying to understand like what we're like trying to do here with the money.
That's it's a combination of things. So I was trying not to jump in with too much. So on, I know there was a question about learning differences. So depending on the school, now this is what's sometimes tricky, depending on the school. If you have a large portion of learners who are over 22, which there are, I would say about 5 of those schools, 5 of the 10 adult charter schools, have a large portion of their adults who don't receive any of the special education funding. But when you look at some of the surveys that are done, you know, for example, some schools use the pain learning needs screening tool. And that flags for you based upon how a learner scores, whether or not, if they disclose that they receive some special education services, that's usually disclosed at the intake, or when you do the pain learning need survey, it will give you an estimate, you know, based upon how that person responds, whether or not they were either identified, or if they didn't disclose, that they may likely need some additional testing to determine whether they have some learning differences. So there's that piece of it. Around standardized tests. So to measure academic process, all schools are either using CASAS, which is used by the city to get entry academic levels, or they're using TABE, which is these are 2 classic adult academic assessments that are used, and we're measuring student progress throughout the year on that, depending on the school. So, I mean, you're seeing some schools have, you know, the overall, when you look at the complete number of adult learners in adult schools, we're showing 50%, over 50% do not have a high school credential. Some schools, and I can say very specifically for Academy of Hope, 90% of our learners do not have a high school credential. So it just depends on the school that you're going to. So what you're looking at as completion is academic progress over the year, because most are coming below a certain, the 6th grade academic skills on reading, and then, you know, numeracy, depending on the school again, are below 4th grade or below. So you're looking at academic process and obtaining a high school credential by passing the GED exam, or going through the competency-based program called the National External Diploma Program. So that's the academic credential. We're also doing workforce training, and we're tracking that as well. So a lot of the adult schools are doing high-level workforce training. So there are measures for earning industry certifications and also employment as part of the work that you're doing with adult learners and post-secondary. So I think it's what's sometimes confusing for folks. With 10 adult schools in the city, you have a large portion of schools that are largely serving English language learners. You have about 5 of the 10 that serve a mix of your classic adult ed student, which is 18 and older, and youth, and so hence the alternative funding. And then you have some schools that are serving only the adults. So that's about 5 schools that are serving 18 and older learners, and some schools that have a small percentage of their learner base that are not ELL learners. So it really is a real mix of schools.
And I like Michelle, just to add more context. The reason why I asked that, right, is because, you know, if we're looking to boost resources, it's like, for what purposes, right? And I think that, you know, some resources like workforce development, like I don't know where adult learners are having those needs met in the sort of workforce strategies that the city is engaged in relative to the academic strategies that like the school, I mean, I know you, Lester, you said it like depends on like what the school is focusing on and their population, but I'm wondering if we want to think about what are we hoping, right? These like potential additional dollars or yeah, these are all kind of considering potential additional dollars. What are we hoping those outcomes are? And like, is this the vehicle or is the other workforce strategies vehicle or what have you? So that's kind of where my brain was going.
So I can certainly, I don't know, Ashley, if you, so I can tell you what largely, if you're even looking at the ELL schools, there are many folks who are coming in who are not proficient in their own language. So you're and are struggling with literacy in their own language. So there's a huge academic component to it. I mean, and even those schools who are working with non-ELL learners, the academic skills are a big portion of the instructional program. So obtaining a high school credential, improving the academic reading and numeracy skills, and that's happening across all of the adult schools. The workforce component is one portion of it, but by and large, it is an academic program. But I know I don't want to speak for Bria and some of the other schools that have larger populations of ELL learners.
The majority of our adult education students at Bria come for our ESL programs. And then we also have 2 workforce tracks, but that is a smaller group of our students.
I have a question about like the different programs that adult schools are offering. Is that something where there's data available? And I don't know if that's collected by OSSI or like PCSB or anything, where there's like a defined, there's like a definition of maybe some of the different programs that are being offered. And that there's like data of enrollment in each of those programs.
Yes, there is. And I'm trying to decide if it's PCSB has it or if it's OSSI. But yes, there's some place. I know we did a lot of that as well during the pandemic. I mean, and I do think, you know, it sort of speaks to some of the issues that people don't know, that we're such a big part of the education landscape, certainly not as large as the compulsory side with the K-12, that there's no one knows where to find information on these schools. And we're educating a lot of people through the adult schools.
I would also just add to that we, particularly the adult charter schools, have to meet a lot of the same accountability frameworks as other K through 12 schools. There is a performance management framework, particularly for adult schools, that looks at some of those outcomes that Leicester was just mentioning around academic outcomes, college and career readiness, high school graduation, as well as attendance and persistence.
I think to answer this question of what additional information, I think to just sort of like, what is the scope of what we're already investing, right? And like to Ryan's point about like, what are the programs that the schools are offering as a result of this? And like, I think that might help us understand like where the opportunities to go deeper or maybe like pivot if, you know, whatever. But I think just sort of understanding already, because I know in the work that I do, right, like I don't pay a ton of attention to the adult schools. So I don't have right now a sense of like how much money is actually being funneled towards the charter, the adult charter schools.
Yeah, I would like to know that too. Like, are there, 0.91 is pretty low. You get the facility allowance, I guess. How, are there other sources? How have you survived? Are there other government money that's coming, or, I'd just be curious about the whole picture.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly, I think we shared on the call when we met with Michelle, most of us are doing independent fundraising to fill in the gaps. So there is no guaranteed other source of funding. So if you are getting any of the workforce funding, you are applying for that. That's a competitive grant. If you are getting any other funder from private philanthropy, those are dollars that you are writing for. There's not something that's automatically coming to adult schools outside of the 0.91% and the facility funding. So any gaps that you're filling is coming through either private philanthropy and fundraising that the schools, all of the schools are doing at some level. And the problem with that is that those aren't dependable funds. I mean, it sort of varies, from year to year, depending on, what source you're using to create those supplements. I mean, I'm sure most of you are familiar with nonprofit fundraising, that you could have a long-term funder for your work for many years and they change priorities. So that's how schools are supplementing any gaps in the funding. And we don't get the add-ons. So even though, you're looking at a significant number of people coming in that either were identified as having a learning difference when they were in school, or through your own assessment or screening, you are providing those services to individuals who need them to be able to get through the GED. And, just giving a few situations with us, we've had folks who needed accommodations, but were never identified and had to pay for a private psychological evaluation to be able to get the accommodations on the GED, because our screening tool said this person may likely be experiencing some learning differences. So we aren't able to pull those dollars down unless we are doing some sort of competitive fundraising to make that happen.
I wonder then, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, I think PCSB collects like budgets and financial reports from every single school, and I'd be curious the proportional difference potentially between adult schools and other charter schools for how much money is coming from private donations, let's say, or like non-UPSFF based sources. And to Kevin, your point of separating out, I think the distinction between like, is the adult weight enough to cover program costs first before then, like, if we were to add incremental dollars, what would we be prioritizing, let's say? Whether understanding that proportion and how different it may be from other charter schools would help us get at whether the weight is or is not sufficient. Because I think what we're hearing qualitatively is that you all feel like you have to do a significant amount of outside fundraising and access to outside funds in order to maintain the level of programming. Curious your reactions to that.
I would also add on the philanthropic side, we find it very difficult to be able to fundraise to pay for salaries, which as a school, that's the largest proportion of our budget. Often philanthropies want to pay for one-time projects or one-time costs because they know that they're not providing a sustainable funding source for salaries that we need to fund on a year-to-year basis. So we can often get like a new initiative funded or some of our wraparound supports, but not necessarily like paying for a teacher. And those are our highest costs. And as a bullet had mentioned on a previous slide, we're still competing for the same staff that many K through 12 schools are. We need teachers, we need social workers, we need speech and language pathologists. We need all of these folks that we would be competing for with schools that have larger budgets or more funds that they can put towards those positions.
Could I ask if there's a larger vision that, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is what is kind of what Kubila was saying. What's are we saying our charge is to make sure that residents of the District of Columbia have access to public funding from kind of the age of 3 right now until they graduate from high school, till they're literate, till they're have a job, or what is our larger, how do we define it? We have funded alternative educations, we have funded the state programs, which are schools to aid youth, for many years before even charters existed. We were saying that everybody has the right to public funding to get a high school degree if they choose to want to go back and do that. And then even at that point, they only have to fulfill the requirements from when they were in high school. That's the way it was done. But I'm just curious, what's our larger vision that's guiding us in terms of, we're talking about the measures and the programs, but do we say that we want to educate anybody in the district who wants to come back and get workforce, or that we want that on the public dollar for these schools we've already started, and for these students that we have failed in K-12 or that have been failed in their own country or whatever? I just don't know what the larger vision is that would guide us toward how we navigate this.
And I think, Kathy, to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, from the DCPS perspective, I think the challenge with this group often is that each, if we were to put a marginal dollar on one thing, is adult the right thing? And because DCPS is an LEA, we're serving all age levels. I think BRIA, of course, serves multiple age levels too. And then we talked about the mix of alternative and adult at lots of charter LEAs that are serving both. But I think from a citywide perspective, and this is why I was trying to make that distinction in the chat of what are the existing costs that the program has, and is the weight enough to cover those existing costs? Mm-hmm. And then more vision aligned, like what do we want for these students and how much would it cost to get to that thing? It feels to me like we don't have the cost base from the first part to be able to answer even the second question. So the first question feels most pertinent for me.
I think it's challenging to answer that first question because, adult schools, we work under the money that we're given. I think what you're asking for is like, what would our ideal budgets be? So that we wouldn't have to fundraise, we wouldn't have to go out and look for other money, that we could pay staff salaries that, we think are more aligned with their expertise and qualifications. And I think that's not a data point that's out there. That's like aspirational.
But I think if I'm hearing correctly, you fill a gap between what you're given in the public funds with private philanthropy. That gap seems to me like where the inadequacy might be in the adult weight. Is that right?
I think that's one measure. I think it's not the full picture, right? As I was sort of trying to explain before, it's difficult to get the philanthropic funds to go towards salaries. Like a big priority for BRIA as a school is we want to increase, we want to increase payment for our staff because we know that they are under the market rate for what other schools are paying them in DC. And sure, we have some philanthropic fundraising that gets us more than just what the UPSFF is, but we're still not at the place where we would like to be paying our staff members. So I think there is something even beyond just what our total revenue is.
But what we sort of have to figure that out, we sort of have to then know, all different charter schools have different salaries for their teachers too, but in order to have some idea of what the cost of the program is, we have to know.
To answer Abe's question in the chat, the adequacy study from 2013 said that adult schools should be funded at the full 1.0 weight. And that was almost 10 years ago now. And we're not close to that. Up until this year, we were only 0.89, so still 11% below what the adequacy study from 10 years ago recommended.
This is Mary Levy. Historically, the first question that somebody asked was about, do we want to serve everybody who has a need and shows up for basic education? And I would say that much is built in to the formula and to the School Reform Act. When we started the formula, we had been through a period when DCPS was offering adult basic education. Rosario was the school for immigrants. We had Armstrong, and we had an external degree program out of the building at 12th and L, 12th and K. And because of budget constraints, the Board of Education decided that they were going to get out of that business. They kept the stay schools for returning dropouts, but the others, they closed. Meanwhile, we had been going through the Goals 2000 process with citywide meetings. We had 6 meetings all over the city, and the supporters of adult education showed up at all those meetings to say that this was a large population that the district really needed to serve and was not. And that consideration went into the setup of the charter schools and the formula. And when we put the formula together, we said, yeah, we're going to do adult ed for those who want to offer it. And in fact, UDC could have offered it too. What happened was that we then went out and we looked at, well, how is adult education like that funded elsewhere in the country? And there really was not a lot of information. What we did find was that different states and even different school districts, if they did it at all, did it in different ways. There was really no way of putting it all together into a coherent picture of what adults needed. And so we somewhat arbitrarily came up with a weight, and it did get increased. But I would say that second only to special education funding, we've not had the really thorough look that's needed in order to determine what these programs need. If we could do that, I think it's important because it's still, a really big need in the district.
I think, I mean, I very, I think to Ashley's, sounds like no matter what we're talking about, there are some basic foundational things that we believe about what it takes to educate. Not maybe not. There are some. There's a spectrum of things that we may potentially believe as a whole group. I don't know if we are already about like what it costs to X, Y, Z. And it sounds like at some point the 1 point whatever was decided to be okay. This is truly the base of what it would take to provide what a student needs in order to be productive in a school. And so I guess the question I have is like, Mary, maybe you know this is somebody else, like why was it the 0.8 or the 0.9 versus the 1 in deciding like what adult schools should receive?
I think a large driver of that was, again, like the ratio of contact hours to students, right? So, and the staff needed to support students who have fewer contact hours than in the K-12 system, right? So if your ratio for like an elementary school student is 1 to 20, and you need that one teacher to serve those 8 hours a day, versus for adult, you can serve 2 cohorts, let's say maybe a morning cohort and an afternoon cohort, or a morning cohort and an evening cohort with that one adult.
There was
Then your
also
cost structure is different. Go ahead, Mary.
there was also the consideration that unlike high schools, regular high schools, adult schools don't have athletic teams. They have really more limited offerings. It's a more limited program. They don't have extracurriculars usually. It's a more limited program than is offered in high schools traditionally.
But on the flip, yeah, but on the
On the
flip
other side, that is just one tiny piece.
yeah, I get it. But it sounds like, and I don't run an adult school, so anybody please correct me. It sounds there are additional costs that are not the same as like of a high school, right? So whether it's childcare being provided, or whether it's the longevity in which like the persistence is actually longer because folks are moving in and out of their own jobs in order to provide for their families. And it sounds like staffing is like that ratio of, and I know this is not what you're saying, that two cohorts to 1 ratio sounds like it's not actually working. Right. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, yes, that is one, I think one example is you need 2 staffs to do that. I mean, some schools are running split schedules with their teachers to cover day and evening. So full-time cost, 1 FTE who does a morning session has this huge break in the middle of their day and comes back and does an evening session. Other places have full-time, daytime staff, depending on the length of their program, and using adjuncts for evening instruction. So it's not an easy staffing model or cheaper staffing model to educate an adult. The other thing that folks may not know is that adult schools are also providing those comprehensive wraparound support services. So most, if you have adults who are coming in, food insecurity, I mean, the same thing we see with kids, but there are other mechanisms that we use for that. Food insecurity, housing insecurity, all of those things, those student support teams are connecting those families, those adults, to those resources in the community to stabilize them to continue their education. And when you talk to most of the adult schools, they have student supports or case managers or whatever the term that's being used to help support learners through those particular barriers to continuing their education. So that's another piece that happens a lot. We don't receive any of the school nursing support. So there are a lot of things that pop up when you're working with adults, a large percentage of adults who are experiencing poverty that you've got to support in order for them to continue to finish their high school credential or to improve their English or to achieve those outcomes, the educational outcomes that are set for adult schools. And that's not without the additional add-ons, you are covering that with the 0.91%. And we saw that, even, in the pandemic in terms of having to provide the technology or the one-to-one devices to adult learners, and
Mhm.
what the CARES funding that flowed to adult schools was inadequate. And most of us are now one-to-one device schools, but the funding that we received did not adequately cover that. Or the COVID mitigation, I mean, that's getting out of the realm of where we are here, but the school models have also changed to include more using, most of the schools now are one-to-one technology schools that were not previously before the pandemic.
I think based on, Lister, how you've described the, like, some schools using a split funding model, some schools using two different staff for those two different cohorts, what I would be particularly interested in and curious again for others in the group to chime in is that what that ratio actually looks like, right? So I feel like student is maybe not the right unit, but contact hours may be a better unit of like staff to contact hours ratio to understand that quantitatively, to then understand, all right, is the need actually, the same level of personnel as it would be for an elementary school, or is it slightly higher or slightly lower, right? And then I think that puts that the weight into context. And then I think you put on top of that to Chelsea's point, like potential additional needs or these extracurriculars or like the additional supports that I think also get to Kathy's point earlier of like the vision for adult education programming. But I think first understanding, given that what we've talked about is like the staffing being both a primary driver of concerns around cost and competitive salaries, and also on the flip side, the potential for where it would be differentiated from that 1.0. I think I would want to dig in more to what those ratios functionally look like right now.
I'm thinking because you mentioned contact hours, the amount of contact hours. Can you say a little bit more
Yeah,
about what you're
I'm
thinking?
thinking about, and again, open to
Yeah.
the group's thoughts here, like a way to quantify or show in reality, like, all right, even if you have two cohorts one cohort in the morning and one cohort in the evening, that each are being served for, let's say, 4 hours.
Uh-huh.
Are we actually staffing those with two separate teachers? Or is it one teacher? Right? Is it one teacher serving 8 hours and twice as many students, or is it two teachers serving those two separate cohorts? Because I think that helps understand the cost driver and the need for similar staffing levels to elementary school. I may not be making sense.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to get to, so there's another level. I mean, I'm maybe. I think the issue is you have an adult coming into your school, for example, who is a non-reader. And how much time does it take to move a non-reader from being a non-reader to a reader? And is contact hours per day the indicator of that? And that's a different program. I don't know that contact hours really sort of gets to that. It is about the end result. I'm having a hard time sort of wrapping my head around contact hours, but maybe this is that age-old philosophical question, right? In education, is it quality hours or is it that? I mean, what you're trying to do is educate an adult who are coming usually either, if they're a non-reader, there's likely something else going on. who they may have received special education services or they were never identified. And then there are a whole other level of services. But maybe contact hours is the way to get there, but it's a little more complex. But I'm going to sit with that one for a minute.
I think I'm wrestling with sort of the same tensions that Leicester is too. And I get we're trying to just nail down like some sort of concrete comparison, but I would also just really push everyone to consider that adult education is quite different than K through 12 education. And I feel like trying to put the same framework on it is just very misplaced. Leicester was getting at this, that adults come with very unique and very varied needs, and adult schools, sorry, are tasked with sort of responding to those needs in different ways. So I guess I'm just saying all this to say that the contact hours for me too just doesn't seem like the right fit. I unfortunately at this time can't recommend like what the other replacement is, but it just doesn't, yeah, it doesn't seem right.
Well, in addition, contact hours is only a part of what generates teacher cost.
Yeah.
Throughout education, there's planning periods, there's professional development, there's school meetings, there are other things that teacher time is spent on than only in contact with students.
Mm-hmm.
And teachers aren't the only staff that we employ either. You know, we have administrative teams, we have student support workers at all of our schools, we have instructional assistants, and so those staff members have different sort of contact hours than just our teachers do.
Question to the group is just if the adequacy study recommended 1.0, the reason for it to recommend something else, because that study was pretty thorough.
Yes, but there's a question as to
Of your question, it kind of me.
there's a question as to how the adequacy study weight relates to the foundation when it's a different foundation. Maybe it's the same and maybe it's not. But what did the adequacy study recommend for high school, for example, as a weight? I think we have to answer that question later, but I'm just saying we can't just take any weight that's in the adequacy study and assume that it tells us all we need to know.
Yeah, Justin here. I think a strong recommendation would just be funding at the adequacy level. You know, I mean, I feel honestly the same way about the at-risk preference. And I think when you have a study that's done well and done thoroughly, the more that this group can recommend funding at that study level, that seems to me like the right thing to do. So I would certainly advocate for funding at the 1.0.
I name a few other of the questions in the chat are things I think that have not yet been addressed. And then for the sake of time, want to save some time to go back to, again, as we committed to the special education and middle school weights, talk about potential needs there, and then make sure we have time for public comment. So someone named, there was a question from Jeanette about whether OSSI regulates the standards for adult learner programs, and whether there's a set of minimum requirements for an adult program. There was a response that the adult charters are subject to the accountability measures from the public charter school PMF, so they have a set of requirements. But Brian, I don't know if you know anything else about any specific like credentialing associated with adult programs or minimum requirements.
There also, if anyone, if a school is receiving funding from Title II, OSSI Adult and Family Education, we owe a Title II funding. There are requirements, performance requirements for that too. So it's student progress, academic gains, high school credentialing, and then typically on the we owe a Title II funding piece would be some employment or post-secondary outcomes as well. So it depends. If you're just in DC receiving the per pupil funding, yes, the adult ed framework, and then you have a separate framework if you're supplementing with adult AFE funding, adult and family education funding. And the two don't always line up nicely.
All right, I'm gonna move us on to the next information. Kabila, I also see your comment that we should have some baseline of data upon which we are making a recommendation, and hearing that adult schools are saying that that it's not enough right now, sorry. So how do we, I think there's still this open question, how do we determine what would be enough? Chelsea adding in a comment around considering extending the at-risk weight. Any other final comments before we just close out this section? And this is not the final adult conversation that we're going to have. We will come back to this. So just for clarity's sake there. All right, Patrice, can you move us to the next slide? Because I do want to make sure we have time to address these as we had told the group last time that we would, which is coming back to the other potential two topics. And one, whether we want to cover additional topics or spend our time digging into the adult wage, which I think, as we're all seeing through this conversation, is complex, and there are a few layers and dynamics here to consider. But we'd previously discussed potentially using some of our time over the next 4 to 5 sessions to revisit the middle school weight. And this was brought up as a result of what we have seen in the most recent PARC results around declines, particularly at the middle school levels, and then also potentially revisiting the special education supplemental weights. And there, again, there was a concern around the complexity of looking at special education weights, and so therefore whether we would look at a specific component of it rather than all the levels and all the weights. So want to bring that back up to the group, and I think similar to where we ended the conversation for adult, think about what baseline information we would need in order to drive towards an informed decision beyond even just how we would change things, but also how we would consider options here.
When we were looking at the high school at-risk weight and the ELL weights, we saw a lot of data on their performance, on the students' performance. And I think there were a lot of questions about how ready for high school do students arrive? And are we doing a good enough job in the middle school at providing the resources? And, in the same way, that question could be asked, like, why are so many students either leaving high school before they graduate or ending up in the alternative or adult ed schools? So it's really it's kind of a large question of how we're educating everybody and where we're missing. And is it because we're not providing enough money or the proper programs, or what is it? I don't have the answer, but I think the reason middle school came up is that because of what we saw in high school in terms of missing the mark, and that's why we added funding to high school. And so that's why the middle school weight came up, like, are we doing enough there? And so I think the information we would need is similar to what we were looking at for high school, like how are the middle school students doing across both sectors? What is all the data about them? That would be a place to start to see. And I don't know if it's a matter of money or not, or what the weight is or isn't covering. But it's significantly less than what we're spending in high school.
I also think that this was my topic area, and we have been interviewing some of the Bold School leaders. In 2 weeks, we'll be releasing a 2022 Bold Performance School report. And what I'm hearing from the middle schools that are represented is really like how they get kids to engage, to be at school, to have fun, to want to be there to learn. And a lot of those things are the sort of extracurriculars that I know that we fund and provide at high schools, but that we don't necessarily fund as prolifically at the middle school level, as just a consideration. The reason why we should really engage in this topic area with some of our middle school leaders.
I'm not
And then-
currently a middle school leader, but I did play one at one time. I think everything that Josh just named is like, this is definitely a moving up the age group thing. Like, does it? I think to Kathy's point, does this help us reduce the number of students who potentially are in danger of not passing in high school, or who may potentially end up in adult schools, even though we know that's not the only reason that we get those. I think maybe, Josh, some of the information we may need would be like, is there a way that we can show from maybe the Bold Performance ones, what they are able to do and what it actually is taking, and that will take a lot of cutting for these individual schools, to kind of show what's possible and what the dollar amount may need to be.
Yep. I mean, we will be releasing that report in 2 weeks. A couple of them are middle school leaders, and we'll feature them. I think that those are maybe the couple of middle school leaders we should potentially bring in and have conversations with about like what. I mean, like we'll talk about what works, but having them specifically mention that and then have them discuss whether those are things that actually cost money or just things that need to be done better with the money that we do provide them.
And then Jack raised a comment in the chat. Kathy Riley raised a big question in the first session about whether the foundation level is adequate given all of the levels and all of the weights. With inflation, increased city investments in behavioral health and schools, conditions have changed. Should we discuss that? And then the middle school and special education supplemental weights build off of that. I mean, I think that does start to get at also a core question around trade-offs, right? Like the increasing of the foundation level has a larger fiscal impact across the board. If we either go for inflation or beyond inflation, the fiscal impact there is larger. And then so I think the question of where we want to spend the incremental dollar becomes particularly important for the group to think about and weigh. Right? Like, is it on the foundation level or the middle school weight, because the marginal dollar we want the marginal dollar to go towards middle school students based on what the conversation happened, or the conversation that just happened.
Yeah, I put that in because when I was listening to the first session, I thought Kathy raised the question of, is what we're doing in general education, enough? Because we have all of these variations. And what strikes me is that when we do the adequacy studies, we're never really able to do everything that we want in these variations. And so I just think it could be worth revisiting that question again.
I think at the end of our time, we always come to that we'll just do the big weight and recommend it because it's too hard to wrestle with this stuff. But I actually think it's really important that we wrestle with the individual weights and we have a chance. So I hear you, Jack, but I think it's important we wrestle with getting the individual weights right. So, I mean, we always get to the end and say, let's just, where we can find consensus. But I think at this point in the second meeting, I would opt for trying to figure out the weights. And I don't know what financial state the city will be in when the budget comes out, or what will happen with that. Certainly was a hefty weight that the mayor raised this year. Whether she would do that again or not, I don't know.
Michelle, I remember last time for this group, there were some charts in this study that had some red, yellow, green, and I don't remember exactly the framing, but I think Kathy was alluding to some of the data. And then there was also something around like easy lift for policy, tough lift for policy, big financial impact, small, big potential learning impact. I don't remember exactly, but that might be helpful for our next meeting if I don't want to suggest work, but something for middle school and special ed, just so the group can get a sense of I don't know, just like the trade-offs that you see with your budget expertise. And anyway, for these two weights in particular, middle school and special education.
I think that was even in the middle school was in those other ones. So you could just pull those back up.
Yeah, one of the other things we discussed was, I think Mary had suggested that the existing levels and weights for special education were set quite some time ago. And is there anything that would help inform the discussion to help us understand the rationale for setting the level 1, 2, 3, 4 weights at the levels that they're at right now that could be presented in the next discussion?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to do some digging on our end.
Thanks very much.
One question I have is, would it be worth this group reading the reports that Chelsea and Ashley linked to, as well as the relevant sections from the adequacy report on adult education? Just, I mean, if other people have already done that, maybe it's just me, but I think that might be really helpful just to understand the universe a little bit better. I mean, everything that people were sharing about this group of schools was really helpful in me understanding what their needs might be and what their current programming was. So that's one recommendation I have as a next step, and something I'm going to do personally.
I want to co-sign on that. If there are some readings or anything that will be helpful for us for the next session as well, or even recaps for this one, I'm more than willing to dive into it because it does help us, is my understanding.
Yeah, we can email out both the link to the DC Policy Center report that Ashley and many of the adult schools worked on, as well as some of the various reports that folks have mentioned, including like the adequacy study.
Agree with what's been shared, and in terms of like what from the adult schools, like what each you know, decimal point dollar amount would equal in terms of services. The more we increase like how much more services or supports would be able to be provided to their student population, I think would be helpful as we wrestle with what the new weight should be.
So are you thinking there like an understanding of, all right, if the weight increased from 0.91 to 0.95, that means X $100 per student. And from the adult school's perspective, this means X type of implication. Is that what you're thinking?
7 more teachers.
Roughly, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
While there seems to be a pause, I will now open up the public comment section. So if there's anyone that is an attendee and wants to come off mute and just you can comment on anything that we have been talking about or any other topic that you want. You can just raise your hand or send me a private chat and I can unmute you. And so I haven't received any notifications yet, so, but that offer is still open for the rest of the meeting if you want to make a comment.
And then the other thing I'll just add is that we do have time again with the a larger group of adult schools next week. So I think one of what we heard around like what does incremental money buy you is I think one thing that we can pose to the group. I think grappling with this like teacher student ratio, teacher hours ratio, like staffing structure is another thing that I think will be valuable to cover with the group given some of the questions and comments that were raised. But if there are others, folks should feel free to raise them now. If it comes to you later as well, feel free to email it.
And I've been jotting down notes about some of the additional data that everyone wants to see that we could potentially be preparing. So I have some stuff for adult schools and middle schools, but I didn't really capture anything for the special education weights. And I just want to make sure that if anybody has thoughts on that. Sorry. Jamie is trying to raise their hand. Oh, I do see that, Jamie. So I'll come back to my request, but Jamie, I am going to unmute you. So can you just say your name and who you're representing or your organization? You should be able to go ahead now, Jamie.
Communications at Academy of Hope. And I'm just chiming in first to make myself available to anybody who would like to continue the conversation before the next task force meeting. I'm happy to talk more or answer any questions. And then one bit of context that I wanted to be sure was highlighted is that a good portion of adult learners are parents and their kids are in the K-12 system. And so I just want to remind everybody that supporting adult learners is supporting children and others in their care. And we're all part of the same ecosystem trying to achieve educational goals for everyone. And so this doesn't have to be an either or conversation. It really is an and conversation. And so just want to be sure we highlight that context here, since I know all of you represent different portions of the ecosystem, that we're all working towards the same goals. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And can you just say your name and your organization again, because that you got cut off at the start.
Sure. My name is Jamie Fragel, and I'm from Academy of Hope. I can drop my name and email in the chat if anybody would like to continue the conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Jamie. And so just to where I was going before that public comment, sped weights, additional data that folks would like to see to make an informed decision about funding for students with disabilities. And I do see Josh's chat. I would like to see key achievement and growth data by primary disability and learn more about how disabilities are sorted into levels. Okay. I think after this, we close out. So if there's any other questions or comments, we do have a little time left together before we do our next meeting. So.
Hey folks, this is Will Henderson from Paul PCS. I just wanted to make one comment that I think in some ways goes without saying, but I think when we have a lengthy conversation about the weights, that it's important, at least for me, especially in this season of all the various funding and resources we received due to the pandemic. I think that any place that we land, I've been reflecting as we were talking about the adequacy study, that we aren't meeting those kind of baseline recommendations yet even. But I'm thinking about how no matter how perfect the weights are, as we kind of like sort through and manage these down to the nth degree, if the resources that we receive in general are not meeting the mark, then the weighting them and kind of increasing based on increased needs is not ever going to get all the way to the rest of the need, you know? And so I know that that's a bit more of an advocacy space that I hope will generate continued kind of momentum and kind of pressure on the mayor's office and in the country. But I do think that the resources that we received through COVID grants and other things our schools have been using widely to meet our needs that were already kind of lagging and lacking in the past. And so I think that in addition to sorting out these baseline weights and then all the diversity that comes after the baseline, I think that we've got to figure out how to put appropriate pressure on the right communities to increase the amount of resources that we receive to serve the needs. I'm speaking in this moment as a representative of a single site LEA, but I know that non-single sites and other schools are facing this on a grand scale in a contrast to other communities. So I think it's important to note that no matter how much we navigate this work with the weights, if the baseline resources aren't meeting the need, then the weights are not going to tackle it further as well.
Thanks, Will. And I see in the chat, can you reshare the link to the adequacy stuff? Yes, we can share that adequacy study with you along with all the other resources that that people have requested. And I guess last call for any more comments. We can send everybody off a few minutes early. All right, well, thank you, everybody. We will post a recording of this meeting on the OSCE website in the next couple days. Thank you all for your continued participation and comments throughout. It's really helpful for us. And you can always email us if you have anything additional that you want to share. Anybody from the public can email us additional items for public comment. And yes, thanks for Patrice. The next meeting is October 20th from 3 to 5 p.m. That is a Thursday, 2 weeks from now. So thank you, everybody, and hope you all have a good night.